Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle, and I will be moderating today's panel for the Government of Alberta's Employment First initiative. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webcast. It's part of a monthly series of webcasts on issues relating to employment of persons with disabilities. This webcast is part of the Employment First initiative's strategy to provide accessible information covering a broad range of topics that are accessible to all Albertans. For more information about this series, check your emails for our regular updates, or you can go to csslearningseries.ca, or you can also follow us on Twitter at AlbertaCSS. We have an exciting discussion lined up today where we will address some of the major questions we have heard from employers around the topic of service dogs in the workforce. To help us dive into these topics, we've brought in here two individuals who can speak from their professional and personal experiences on the matter. With the help of our panelists, we are going to take time to explore topics like what employers need to provide for service dogs, how staff needs to be oriented for a service dog, and how to address staff who aren't necessarily comfortable around being with a dog. And as always, you'll be able to pose your questions to our panelists via our live chat, which is just below your video window. We will address as many of these questions as we can during the question and answer period at the end of the panel. So let's start off today's session with some introductions. John Wheelright was previously the Executive Director of Dogs with Wings Assistance Dog Society. It's an Alberta-based provider of guide and service dogs. And in addition to his 8 years in that role, he has been active in the sporting dogs and pet world for over 50 years. Lui Greco currently works for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind as National Manager of Advocacy. Lui is joining us today along with his guide dog, Onyx. Nicole is our online moderator. She's going to pose your web chat questions to our guests. Today's session is also being recorded, and the video will be posted on the CSS Learning Series webpage after the live recording. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us today, John and Lui, and of course, Onyx. John, can you tell us a little bit about your history working with service dogs?
Well, I've been involved, as you mentioned in the introduction, with dogs for most of my life, primarily with sporting dogs, pointing dogs, and some showing and so on and so forth. But I became involved in the service dog world as a volunteer. I volunteered with Dogs with Wings to raise a puppy, which is the first stage of training what ends up being something like Onyx. And gradually got more involved in the organization and became executive director. My book of business at that time was to grow the organization to meet the incredible need that we were experiencing for dogs.
How did you manage to do that over your time there?
Well, we added infrastructure, we added trainers, we increased our breeding program, we had developed additional volunteer programs in centers other than Edmonton, head offices in Edmonton, but we ended up with puppy raising programs up in Grand Prairie, Red Deer, and then the Calgary metropolitan area. So the idea is to grow your sphere of influence, to give you more volunteers that can take on more dogs that can help more Albertans. So those were my marching orders.
And what is your work now with the government?
Well, I've gone from being a provider, a producer, to a regulator. I'm working in the disability support section, and my work revolves largely around proposed changes to the service dog legislation that's in force here in Alberta.
Thank you. Lui, let's turn to you and your pal, team member, Onyx. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Onyx is my third guide dog. I've been working with guide dogs since 2004. Up until then, I had been using a white cane as my primary mobility device. Currently, as you said, I work with the CNIB as a National Manager of Advocacy. I'm based in Calgary, but do spend a fair bit of my time back and forth across Canada, talking to different folks about some of the issues facing people who are blind and visually impaired. Prior to joining the CNIB in 2011, I've worked for small information technology companies to major international business process outsourcers, as well as third-party offshore consulting services as a systems analyst, as a program developer, call center, customer contact center agent and supervisor. I've done a bunch of different things.
How does Onyx help you with day-to-day living?
Onyx is at the risk of sounding perhaps a bit crass, Onyx is simply a mobility aid. He helps me navigate streets, avoiding obstacles, hazards like steps and curbs, navigating around a crowd, so in a shopping mall, for instance, or in a grocery store, finding the clearest path of travel from point A to point B. Contrary to myth or popular belief, he doesn't know where I'm going. Many of my colleagues and friends would often say that I don't know where I'm going, so it's hard to expect that of the dog. But Onyx's job is just simply to get me, to help me avoid obstacles and hazards in a safe and dignified manner. And he does that, I think, quite well.
How would you say your life has changed since going from the white cane, to the dog?
I think it's important to put it out there and say that guide dogs aren't for everyone, and guide dogs are not the ideal mobility aid for people who are blind. They're not absolutely necessary. It's not like a must-have. However, for someone like myself who used a cane for more years than I care to remember, a guide dog is a very different experience when I'm traveling. I don't have to memorize where the newspaper stands or the trees or the poles are on every sidewalk that I walk down on a regular basis so that I can avoid them. The dog does that. When surprises present themselves, like a new construction zone or a tricycle in the middle of the sidewalk, obviously with a cane, that's something you find, and if you're alert and attentive, you react accordingly. With the guide dog, I don't even know that those things are there anymore. So I can be walking and not have to be focusing 100% of my brain power on where does the sidewalk curve here, so that I don't walk out in the middle of the street, or when I encounter an unexpected obstacle, how do I get around that? The dog does that. So the short answer to your question is I'm more relaxed when I walk with a guide dog, because I'm not having to manage all of that other environmental information and react accordingly.
You've put a lot of trust in Onyx.
No, I don't. I put a lot of trust in myself, my ability, my skills, my ability to respond to what the dog tells me. After all, he is a dog. He is highly trained to react in a certain way to the stimulus that he receives around him. It's up to me to know what to do when he does that. So when he zags and zigs, is he doing it to get me around something? And if so, then I have to learn to react accordingly.
I want to talk about the history of service dogs in the workplace. So John, why don't you take us back, because you do have some
Well, the dogs
insight.
have been assisting mankind for many, many, many hundreds of years in agricultural settings. Of course, they were herding animals, or they were ratters, or they served functions. And I think that the development of task challenges for dogs has developed very organically over the years. From an agricultural setting, then the human-animal bond became primate, and you have people getting pets because they get along so well. It's generally acknowledged that a pet animal can provide emotional support, lowers blood pressure, makes you feel good at the end of a bad day. But strictly speaking, within the confines of our discussion today, guide dogs were really the first of the, what would you call it, animal-assisted therapies. And they developed, oddly enough, largely as the result of mustard gas that was used during the First World War and the blindness and low vision that caused. The first guide dog organizations that were specifically set up to train, to place these dogs were in fact in Germany. Shortly thereafter, the Americans realized what a benefit guide dogs could provide. So many schools started to develop in the States. Since that time, around the turn of the last century, we've seen a dramatic increase in the need for different types of dogs. So now we have this large catchment group called service dogs, and a service dog may assist somebody with no mobility, confined to a wheelchair. Maybe they have MS, they have a balance issue, an inner ear problem, so they need a dog to brace. You need a dog maybe to alert to blood sugar level in a diabetes situation, so there are dogs now that are trained to mitigate that. Autism is a huge concern. It seems to have come out of nowhere in the last 20 years. There are many dogs now being trained to work very effectively for these special children who have this condition, living on that spectrum. So from an industry point of view, what we see is a continued growth as more and more conditions are identified that can be mitigated by the use of a canine. Then I think you're going to see more dogs being required. And a corollary to that, you have an acceptance. Now people are more used to seeing dogs in a work situation or on a street or in a restaurant, a library, a doctor's office, so that along with the need for these dogs, we're seeing a growing acceptance and understanding that these are not pet animals. They're there to do a job, and they are necessary for the people who use them.
So talking about the workplace, how does an employer prepare for a service dog to come in?
Well, the same way a good business will plan for anything, and that is setting up a communication strategy, explaining to staff members that there is one of their colleagues requires the use of a dog, that the dog is not a pet, that the dog is there as a medical assistive device, I guess, and that there are rules around the dog. If there are fears around the dog, those can be mitigated, compromises can be come up with, but essentially setting the groundwork ahead of time is probably the best thing an employer can do, making sure that everybody understands why the dog is there. Usually there's confusion. Well, if he can bring his dog, why can't I bring my dog? My dog makes me feel better too. Well, yes, but your dog is not task trained to mitigate aspects of a disability that you have. Whereas in Louis's case, that dog is matched to his needs and meets them, I dare say, very well.
Louis, what do you think? How should employers handle the introduction of a service dog into the workplace?
Well, let me tell you what I've done in the all too many places that I've worked at over the last 15 years or so that I've had a guide dog. When you go through the interview process, that question always comes up about disability and accommodations, and once the conversation concludes, my suggestion to the recruiter or the hiring manager, as John said, is to simply provide a communication. Most organizations will do some kind of, we'd like to welcome Michelle to our organization. She is going to be assuming the role of whatever. They give you, provide a 1 or 2 sentence or paragraph, depending on how important your role is, as to your background. And at the end of that, I've always suggested just simply tell them. I work with a guide dog. The dog assists me to mitigate my blindness or my vision loss. He is not a pet. Please don't interact with him when he's at work. He will lie out of the way at my desk in a way so as not to interfere with anyone. And if people do have concerns, either allergies, fears, religious beliefs that make them uncomfortable, then to simply raise them to whoever, either their supervisor or their manager, or once sort of the ice has been broken, I always encourage people just to talk to me directly. You know, I'm afraid of dogs, I'm allergic to dogs. Then we need to find a way to accommodate both of us. My need as a person with disability, I require job accommodation so that I can do my job, but so does everyone. So if your allergies make it difficult for us to work together on a project where we're in a confined space where the dander is going to aggravate your allergies, then perhaps we work in a larger room where there's more space between us, and your allergies aren't going to be aggravated. If we're in a meeting, again, if for whatever reason you don't or can't be in close proximity to the dog, if I know that, then my personal approach is that I do what I can to mitigate any anxiety or fears that my colleagues may have. So that might mean that I go into the meeting room first and I position myself at the farthest possible corner so that John here, who's maybe afraid of dogs, can sit close to the door. It's all about making everyone feel comfortable, and the only way you can achieve that is by everyone being open and honest and saying, you know, I'm concerned, I'm afraid, I need, and then negotiating a settlement that works for everyone.
Yeah. Compromise.
Yeah.
John, what else can employees do themselves to prepare for this and compromise, like you say?
Well, I think that Louis given us a good key here in terms of his willingness to discuss one-on-one. I think communication one-on-one between the person with the concern and the guide or service dog user is probably the best way. Sometimes it'll require the intermediation of a supervisor or a human resources person. That's fine. But the point is, the discussion is the key. You have to have the discussion. It's through talking to each other that we resolve all kinds of differences in our world. So I think it's for employees, it's helpful to have a cheat sheet of rules. Please don't touch the dog. Please don't feed the dog. Please don't try and call the dog. Helpful things like when you're talking to Louis, talk to Louis, not to Onyx. That's just a kindness thing. But it's things that maybe people don't realize off the top of their head. They don't know that from their ordinary life. So it's perfectly appropriate to set out the boundaries. If people understand that the dog is going to be at Louis' desk and not wandering freely down the hallway, that may be a help. If the person with a fear of dogs can be told about the amount of training and that he's been chosen because he has no aggression whatsoever, that the thing he'd really like to do is get out of his harness and give you a big kiss. Maybe that's going to help, maybe it isn't, but at least it sets the tone for a more open discussion. Allergies with dogs, don't touch the dog. I mean, yes, there's dander in the air, but if you have a really severe allergy, maybe you want to plan a different route through the office so that Louis with his dog uses this corridor to get to his office and the person with the allergy uses a different corridor. Or an air cleaner might be a solution.
I've gone as far as, especially for people with with fears of dogs, either religious or psychological fears, I've gone as far as to tether my guide dogs to my workstation. It's completely unnecessary because the dog, as you can see, this is what he does, and he gets paid for it. So he'll lie there for hours. If I get up to stretch my legs or go walk down the hall to talk to a colleague, or if I have a meeting for an hour with someone, and if it's an environment that I'm comfortable walking around without my guide dog, I'll leave him at my desk, and he won't move. He'll be right there when I come back. And most guide dogs are exactly like that. But for people who do have fears, if seeing that the dog is tethered and tied up and that they can see the leash or a tie down or some constraint that assures them that the dog isn't going to wander, and if it makes them feel better, quite honestly, the dog doesn't care. He doesn't even know because he's just at rest. For me, it's just simply a matter of undoing another buckle, which is nothing as far as an accommodation or an inconvenience from my perspective.
How often do you get people who are afraid or have the religious concerns?
Lots. In some of the larger organizations that I worked in a call center with where there were 400 people on the floor at one time. We worked in an environment where the workstations didn't even have separating walls. So within a 20-foot square area, there'd be 10 or 5 or 10 agents on the phone. So very, very close quarters, and there were a lot of people that were of Asian descent, and it was a major concern for them. So what I did there was, when I was an agent, when I was one of them, if you will, I simply always took the workstation at the farthest possible corner in the designated space that we had to work at, that we were assigned. And my colleague, who maybe wasn't comfortable with the dog, would sit at the opposite end. Create that distance and create that comfort zone. But again, we only achieved that because we had the conversation.
And was it successful?
Yes, absolutely.
How important, John, are the rules and following the rules?
Well, yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it speaks more to the value of the dog as an assistive appliance, if you will, and I know they're sentient beings, so I'm using that term in a very specialized fashion. The point is that if you distract a dog, let's say Louis is walking down the street, he's approaching the intersection of Jasper Avenue and 104th Street. There's a traffic light there. He's trying to get a sense of what's going on. He's listening very carefully to the traffic so that he can tell what's happening. He approaches the curb. The dog comes right up to the curb and stops as he's been trained to do, and somebody distracts the dog, says, "Oh, nice dog," and hands him a cookie. That's a potentially life-threatening situation for Louis. Now, I'm over-dramatizing it, but those situations have occurred.
I was going to say that's a pretty natural human reaction, because as soon as Onyx came in, I wanted to pet Onyx too, because I'm a huge dog lover.
Of course, and anybody that responds to a big, black, beautiful, Labrador, male, blocky head, gorgeous-looking dog, it's natural. The animal-human bond is prevalent in our society, but unfortunately the downside of that is that you may take liberties with somebody else's dog that put them in danger. So if the dog is not concentrating on the handler, in Louis' situation, because he can't see, that's potentially lethal. A mother who has her child tethered to an autism dog is trying to make her way through West Edmonton Mall. Autism is a condition that can result in meltdown behaviors. The children don't respond well to various visual and auditory stimuli. The mother may be just keeping it together. She needs to go and buy a pair of trousers for her child that's going back to school next week. It's essential that she makes her way through the mall safely and efficiently. If somebody comes up and says, oh, tell me about your dog, I want to pet your dog, can I pet your dog? That can not only interfere with mom's ability to do the task that she's there to do, but it can also cause a meltdown for the child with autism. So I don't mean to overstress it, but the rules around the dogs are not because the handlers, I mean, Louis is a gentle, kind soul and loves that dog. I know he does. It's not that people with dogs are trying to be mean or sniffy or standoffish. It's just that if you take the dog's focus away, you're minimizing the dog's training. You feed a dog a treat enough and the dog is not going to care about the handler's commands. He's going to be after the treats. So that's why the rules are there, and they're there to preserve the incredible amount of training that's gone into these dogs. The schools that produce these animals budget on the basis that they can be worth anywhere between $25,000 and $40,000. So they're like a finely tuned car. You don't misuse a finely tuned piece of equipment. You have to, there are rules and practices that you abide by, and they're there to protect the integrity of the dog handler team.
Louis, how important is it then to educate the public about these rules?
It's very important. I think the one comment that I would make to what John was saying is this real? And I have to say, with air quotes, it's very real. I've been standing on the edge of an LRT platform with an oncoming train, trying to figure out whether it's my train or not, and people will start talking to the dog. And what happens over and over again is I'll say, please don't interact with the dog. And they say, oh, I know that. And they'll keep petting. And I think it's because they don't believe that I'm aware of their interacting with the dog when I've asked them not to. There can't be enough education as far as I'm concerned. And again, to reiterate John's point, it's not that I don't want people to play with my dog. When the time is appropriate, when it's safe for me, when it's appropriate for the dog, it's a lot of fun to have the dog run and chase a ball or go for a swim, but not when I'm on the middle of the sidewalk or catching a train or trying to find my way through an airport or any other place where I need him to do what he's trained to do.
We've talked an awful lot about the rules and the strictures and the thou shalt nots. I think it's also important to know it's imperative, and no proper school will place a dog with a client who's not prepared to take the harness off and let the dog rip around and be a dog. It's essential that these dogs have downtime, just like it's essential for all of us on a Friday night to kick back and relax a little bit. Louis, I dare say you take your dog to the off-leash park and let him.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So, and that happens. So it's we don't want to leave people with the impression that these dogs are work and no fun. That's not the case at all. It's just that when they're working, they have to be working, and when it's fun time, that's the time to enjoy.
The whole question around dialogue. I've had people approach me with small children in an environment where the rules say don't let anyone pet your dog. But I don't like to admit it publicly, but I do have a heart. And if a 2-year-old kid is there and mommy starts saying, "Oh, you can't touch the dog," and I can hear the child getting excited, I'll stop, and I'll tell Onyx to sit and let the child come up and pet the dog, and hopefully mom will explain this is a working dog and this is what he does. And does the kid get it? Probably not. But the point is that I'm in control. I can stop doing what I'm doing. I can put myself in a situation where I'm not at risk or embarrassment of walking into a fountain or tripping over a bench or something, which is maybe not hazardous but embarrassing. But I can take control of the situation, allow the child to interact with the dog, and create yet another what we call ally in the in the fight around public education.
Yeah, the guide and service dog users are actually advocates for the movement. Every time you put another client dog team out in the community, a school will spend time saying, look, you're not going to win every battle. Every trip to Safeway is not going to be as efficient and as economical as you want it to be. And you have to decide how much time you're going to spend answering questions. Some days you just have to get in and get that box of milk and get on your way. Other days you may have more time. But on those times, on those occasions when you do speak to the larger community, you're being an ambassador. You're helping guide and service dog users that haven't yet been matched with their dog, right? You're building a body of understanding in the community of why these dogs are the way they are, what their jobs are meant to be.
And that word compromise comes into play again, right?
Always, always. I can't imagine a scenario where compromise is not required.
And a lot of teachable moments.
Yes.
That very much applies in the workplace. There are, 99.9% of your workday is structured around doing your job, or it should be. But when you've got, a company picnic or barbecue or a social event of some kind, either at the office or at someone's house, people want to talk to the dog, and they've checked with me first, just so that I know. It's not that I have to be the master of everything, but I just need to know that someone is interacting with my dog and not feeding him cheese or grapes or things that the dog shouldn't have. Yeah. So there is a time and a place for everything, and most of us, I'm speaking for people who are blind specifically, we love to interact with folks. We love our dogs. We need them to do a job, and we're always looking to strive that balance between efficiency, productivity, and respecting people's boundaries.
And let's talk a little bit about the training, because you mentioned about feeding dogs. That's a lot of people just like to feed dogs because they think it's a sign of
food equals love.
Yeah, exactly, and people do that all the time.
Sure.
But you were telling me about Onyx and the cookie example that you gave me before we went on there. Can you explain that, why it's important, first of all, for me not to give Onyx, slip him a piece of cheese, and why you're able to put food in front of him and he reacts accordingly?
Okay, just to put it in context, what we were talking about is the ability of a properly trained guide dog to resist the temptation to eat food, and Onyx can do that. If I told him to stand up now and we were to throw a cookie a foot in front of him, I could tell him to sit there and leave it until I wanted him to go for it. That's a training mechanism. It instills discipline, and it enforces reward for correct behavior. If food is used in other contexts, then as a training tool for me, that becomes less effective. So when I use food as a reward for appropriate behavior, and John here decides to leave a plate of cheese and chocolate chip cookies on the floor so the dog can get it, all of a sudden the dog doesn't associate food with reward for good behavior anymore. They just become a scavenger. And let's be honest, labs are notorious scavengers.
Eating machines.
Their gene that tells them that they've had enough to eat is turned off.
It's an interesting thing, actually. Labs are very good because they are motivated by food, and you can use them. You can use food to train a lab very effectively. Flip side of that coin is what Louis just said. They love to eat. So you've got to be very careful, otherwise you'll end up with a lab that looks like a coffee table. And,
what kind of dogs are good for service dogs? What kind of breeds?
Labs and what's that third one? Labradors.
Yeah.
They're a favorite of mine. There are other breeds being used. There's a very, very, very competent school in the center of Canada that has developed a strain of standard poodles They are used in situations where the client who needs the dog may have an allergic response to a dog. There's no such thing as a hypoallergenic dog, but dogs that grow their hair as opposed to throwing hair are a little bit easier to tolerate. But for the most part, the better schools are using Labradors for service and guide work. For hearing dogs, you can open it up a little bit more. There are some smaller dogs working, smaller breeds working as hearing dogs to alert to danger or push an emergency button or to alert that there's somebody at the door or the phone is ringing, those kinds of things. But for service work in this scenario, I'd be hard-pressed to find a better dog than a lab.
So what is it that makes them so good?
Well, they're breeding. Yeah, they've got wonderful personalities. They're very loving dogs. They're easy to train. They are relative to other dogs healthy. They only suffer from a very few deficits that you can breed to control: hips, eyes, elbows. So they're robust of health, easy to train. They will transfer their affections from a volunteer puppy raiser to a trainer to a client at the end of the day very effectively. They're understood. Everybody knows labs, right? They're not perceived as a threat, generally speaking.
So I can take him into a mall or a school or a church, and he doesn't come across as menacing or fearful. As we're shepherds, regardless of their personality,
Yeah.
people will look at them and say, "Oh, that's an aggressive dog," when the dog, in essence, may be the most passive, suckiest creature on the face of the earth. It's just a perception.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, sometimes they get bad reputations.
Yeah.
because we live in a social society, it's all about acceptance and tolerance, and the easier we can make it by having a friendly-looking dog, then that just helps
Yeah.
open up that line of communication that much faster.
So you touch on fear. What are some of the other challenges in the workplace for having a service dog in the area? Louis?
There's not many, really. We've covered a lot of them. Basically, the most important one is communication, making sure that everyone understands the do's and don'ts. I'm really uncomfortable with the word rules, but it seems to be the only one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
The line of communication is the biggest one. Other than that, Michelle, there really isn't much. If once people become comfortable with asking questions or spotting things, it just becomes just a natural part of the workday. I've had colleagues point out, minor nicks and scratches on my various dogs. They've either gotten into something that they shouldn't have, and they've got a nick on their foot or a little mark on their fur. So, that dialogue works both ways. It's beneficial for me because if I can't see it, obviously, but if a colleague is looking at my dog and they say, "Hey, his eyes look a little swollen today," or "he looks like he's got a little, something wrong with him," then I can address it. So it's, communication works two ways, and it helps me and helps them. It's all good. It can all be good.
Lots of the kids that are using autism dogs are using them in a school setting, so the dog will accompany them to school. In the school setting, the handler will be an educational aide or a teacher, because these kids don't handle their own dogs. But it's odd what we've noticed at the beginning when you're introducing the dog to the school setting, there's usually a school assembly and the principal gets up and says, what he says, and then the school that's placing the dog will get up and start talking about the rules, and this particular child, as you all know, has this condition, and this dog is meant to help with that condition. And over time, once the kids get to understand why the dog is there and the rules around it, and see the dog in the library and see it moving down the hall and see how much it helps, it actually becomes a learning experience for the whole school population. And we've seen this time and time again, where there might be initial resistance to the idea, well, allergies, or we're not so sure about dogs in our culture. And then you fast forward 6 months and you know, the dog is at the school assembly and is being celebrated as being a champion for this child. So it really, they do more good than people realize at first blush.
Just have to give them time.
Yep.
If you interchange the word school with workplace.
Yeah, exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
Yeah.
Resistance, initial resistance, education, understanding, communications, and within a very short period of time. The thing that I've heard more often than not is, oh, I forgot you had a guide dog, because it works. People don't interact with him, they don't play with him when they're not supposed to. He stays where he's supposed to stay, and it just becomes another part of the furniture.
Yeah. The best thing is getting up from a table in a restaurant where you've been eating a meal over an hour and a half, and people who have joined surrounding tables in the meantime go, they had no idea there was a dog there. That's when you know the dog is working. Dog isn't there as an entertainment value. It's there to do a job. And unobtrusive, under the table, under a chair.
Just like Onyx is doing right
Just
now.
like
You
what
would
he's
never
do-
know.
And is he bothering anybody?
No.
Yeah.
How are you able, Louis, to travel better now that you have Onyx?
As I said earlier, Michelle, I just don't worry as much about obstacles. For instance, my wife and I went on a cruise last year, and we decided, for a variety of reasons, to leave Onyx at home. So I wiped the dust off my cane and threw it in my suitcase, and away we went. Well, when we were on the ship and in Mexico and touring around Los Angeles, using a cane in a strange environment like that I've never been in before, just reminded me how much the dog does as far as managing those environmental things that the cane did. I was a lot more tense, walking around the ship from the pool to the casino. Okay, I stopped at the bar a couple times. But navigating a cruise ship with 3,000 of your closest friends, half of whom are 16 and under, with a cane was a nightmare. If I had the dog, we would literally just zip around. He would cut the crowd in such a way that, either he'd go around the crowd or he'd see an opening between people, and he'd navigate right through it. With a cane, I had to manage that. I had to, find the hole, and it's not easy. Fortunately, my wife and I hung around a lot on the ship together, so she took on the task of guiding, and it was great. But there were a lot of times when she wanted to do one thing and I wanted to do something else, and I said, I'll see you back at the cabin in 3 or 4 hours. I'm going to go read my book by the hot tub, or I'm going to go sit in the casino for a bit. If I had the dog with me, it would have been a lot easier to get around. And the cruise ship companies realize that people with guide dogs and service dogs are consumers, and we spend a lot of money on entertainment, and they accommodate us quite well as customers. It's come a long way.
You say it makes it easier for you, but it also must make it easier for those 3,000 other people on the cruise. That you're
getting tapped in the
leg
by a
you're
cane.
you'd be able to do your own thing and really not impact anybody else. Is that correct?
Perhaps. I don't know. I don't know if there's, I really don't know. I don't know how to answer that.
How else do you think, John, that having a service dog helps with travel?
Well, I think that with the training that they receive, you get into a taxi cab and the dog is not up on the seat. The dog is trained to be down on the floor. In a bus situation, the dog should be trained to be under, the command is under, and the dog will be between the feet and the chair. So the dog would occupy this space, leaving the aisleway perfectly clear. Same in a train situation. In a restaurant, the dog would be under the table, so not out in the middle of the floor, interfering with the serving staff's ability to get food around. It's a minor wrinkle, I guess, because they are a dog and they're not shaped like a person and they don't sit in seats the way people do, but a combination of the size of the dog and the training that the dog has received, the object of the exercise is to provide as minimal interference to others as possibly can be arranged. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As a handler, I take full responsibility for my dog wherever I am. It's up to me, and this is again indoctrination that the schools hammer into people when they're providing the guide dog or the service dog. You are responsible for your dog's behavior. It's not a bad dog, it's a bad handler. So if your dog is lying in the middle of an aisle at a restaurant and wait staff are either, tripping over him or whatever, that's my problem. That's not the restaurant's problem. It's my responsibility to put the dog in such a way that he doesn't interfere with other people. And exactly the same premise applies in a workplace. Keep the dog out of people's way. He is not to interfere with other people doing their work, and that's my responsibility.
All right, we have questions from the audience, so we're going to take it over to Nicole.
Excellent. This question is from Tracy. Are service dogs used for kids with FASD/ADHD? If so, is Dogs with Wings the starting point, and what's the waiting list?
I would have to refer that question right back to Dogs with Wings. My understanding is that there isn't such a program for FASD at that school. It's important to understand that each of the schools are independent. They've established the programs that they want to offer, that they're able to offer, and being funded in the fashion that they are, it's very difficult for them to just be everything to all people. So the first line is approach the school themselves. They're in the best position to be able to tell you what programs they offer and what the waiting times might be.
There is Melissa, who's a mother looking for a service dog for her child, and the quote was quite high in her opinion, but understandably. Is there support for her financially, and where can she look for that?
The schools that are recognized by Assistance Dogs International, or in the case of guide dogs, they're governed by the International Guide Dog Federation. Those are two oversight bodies that set and maintain standards for the schools that produce them. They're peer reviewed. So they set standards and they assess schools and make sure that everybody's doing the right thing. They are all operating as nonprofits, and ADI's ruling principle is we're a charity. We raise money in the community to support the work that we do. There may be a minimal application fee and equipment fee, but essentially the dog is provided free of charge.
Louis, if I can just interject, what are the costs associated with having Onyx?
Having or getting them?
Well, I guess getting and then having.
Well, as John said, the school that Onyx is trained in is an IGDF certified school. They flew me in, put me up for 2 or 3 weeks in a dorm type settings, fed and watered both of us, flew me home at no cost to me. I make regular donations to the school because fortunately today anyway, I'm able to afford to do so, and as long as I'm working and have an income that allows me to do that, I'll keep making my contributions every year. Keeping the dog is a completely different story. Some of the schools offer stipends. Some are lifetime stipends, some are limited, depending on the school's resources, their ability to raise funds. But I'm in a position where I leave that for other folks who need it more than I do. So vet bills, you can't walk out of a vet's without spending $100. Food,
$60 a month.
60 bucks, yeah, 50, 60 bucks a month. Toys, bathing. You know, he gets groomed professionally every 3 or 4 months, just to keep him clean and tidy. It adds up. I just did my taxes, and I think last year I spent about $1,800 in dog
I was
expenses.
going to say $1,500 is about, I know that that's one organization in Edmonton says to their clients, figure on $1,500 a year, could be more, could be less. One of the great ways to mitigate that, though, is to take on pet insurance. Now, there are premiums, of course, but you know, if you have a catastrophic injury that requires immediate surgery on the very month that you don't have the money to pay for it, an insurance policy can be a godsend. So that's something for people to consider as
Yeah,
well.
because it's never a good time, right?
It's never a good time to pay an unexpected bill.
But it's well worth it, right, to have the $1,500 to $1,800 cost per year. I
Yeah.
mean, it's invaluable to you, right?
And the
Louis?
schools will talk to clients before the dog is placed. You know, look, there are responsibilities, you know, the exercise, the care, and the money. Are you able to bear those costs? And if the answer is no, then sometimes there are other, you know, as Louis mentioned, there are schools that have stipends. Many schools have a slush fund so that if people fall into hard times and need something on an immediate basis, there is an ability to assist. But I think people should go in with their eyes open. There are costs associated, and you need to figure those into your budget when you're considering, is a dog right for my situation?
Makes sense. Nicole?
Are there any workplaces that would not be suitable for a service dog other than construction, etc.?
Transplant ward in a hospital, maybe?
Food processing, slaughterhouse.
Yeah. Any place where there's chemicals lying around, you know, the environment has to be safe. It's hard to give a sort of a list of places, but overall you need to assess what risk the dog would be under in that scenario. And the reason I mentioned a transplant ward is because of the risk of infection. Those are very, very controlled. The rules around service dogs in Alberta, at least, the dog can go any place an able-bodied person is able to go. So a burn ward or a transplant ward is not a place where any able-bodied person is able to go without restrictions. So,
And I'm sure they would discuss that when
Oh,
you went
yes.
to an organization,
Yeah.
obviously,
Yeah.
and talked about it, and you'd say, you know, well, where do you work, and,
Yep.
you know, what kind of things do you do, where do you want to take this dog? That would all
the
be
discussion
discussed.
with the employer would have to be, you know, maybe work duties would have to be modified, or work location would have to be changed.
Should a job candidate disclose they have a service dog in the initial application process or wait till the interview?
Louis?
Wow. You know, that is probably, I'm speaking now as a person with a disability. Boy, I really struggle with how to answer that. There's two schools of thought, at least. One says disclose early. One says don't disclose until you've been selected for an interview. Sorry, there's three schools. And the third school says don't disclose until you walk in for the interview. I don't know what the right answer to that is. I think what the underlying theme to that question is will I be discriminated against when I disclose? And whether we like to admit it or not, the answer to that is yes. Discrimination still happens. I've applied for jobs that I know I was at least warranted an interview, but that particular day I felt, well, this is an employer who preaches diversity and has all the right rhetoric on their website, all disclosed. Never even got a response. And you know, other organizations, other jobs that where I've also disclosed, it hasn't made a difference. I think for most people with disabilities, finding the right answer to that question is really, really hard, and I don't think there is a right answer to it.
What happens to Onyx when he retires?
Well, if my wife and I are still in the same living arrangement that we're in now, we're in a condo. The the rules, the laws in Alberta provide me no rights to keep Onyx as a dog where large dogs like him aren't permitted when he's not a service dog. But generally speaking, people have the option of keeping the dog, finding another home for the dog, or giving it back to the school. And I know that the schools that I've worked with over the past 12 odd years, they often remind us that they have lists of people who will take retired guide dogs. This guy, by the time he retires, will probably be 10 or 11 years old. He'll still have a few good years left. His predecessor is now with the family of a colleague of mine who took a retired guide dog at 11 years old. So he'll live out the rest of his years as a pet.
Must be tough to say goodbye.
Oh yeah, sure, it's tough.
Last question, just for that mother, where can she go? Is there a one-place stop that she can look up online to get all the information about potentially getting a service dog?
I can refer her to an organization. It's a collective of all of the Canadian schools, all of the accredited Canadian schools, and it's a kind of an unwieldy name, but maybe we can post the link after. It's the Canadian Association of Guide and Assistance Dog Schools, and it's cagads.com, so CAGADS.com. And when you hit the main page, if you look along the bottom, there are the visual identities of all of the schools. If you just click on the school, it'll come up, their website. It's linked directly to their website, and then she can begin her search. You're welcome.
Well, great information from both of you. We really appreciate you coming in.
It's been a pleasure.
And a thank you to Onyx, who was working hard the whole time.
Oh, Onyx?
Hey, Onyx.
me?
Me?
A big thank you to our guests, John, Louis, and of course, as I mentioned, Onyx, for generously sharing your experience and insights with us. And to all of you who tuned into this session, we're grateful you've spent the hour with us, and we hope that you found the conversation informative and helpful. As we mentioned in the opening, this webcast is part of the Government of Alberta's Community and Social Services Learning Series, which will be running around the same time each month through to June of 2017. This series covers topics from the Employment First initiative, like the one you saw today, but also has series developed by the Alberta Brain Injury Initiative, Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, and the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee, also known as OPGT. To get updates and registration information about each of the sessions, please email us at hs.employmentfirst@gov.ab.ca and ask to be added to our mailing list. As mentioned, today's webcast was recorded and the video will be posted online along with videos from all the previous webcasts. The video link will be sent out to all the registrants in the near future, and we encourage you to share this video with anyone you think may be interested. If you have any feedback about today's webcast, please email us at hs.employmentfirst@gov.ab.ca and let us know. We, of course, would love to hear from you and your ideas. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you again next month.